Good day. Welcome to a noodle discussion. I'm Randall McNamara in Portland, Oregon, and we've got a very busy week today, this week at Ruby. So we have Ken Rubin doing some office hours tomorrow. On Wednesday, Fran will be doing a vegan desserts talk for Thanksgiving. And then on Thursday, Barton Seaver will be doing a Thanksgiving presentation, mostly plant-based, but he'll also talk a little turkey if you have questions. So with that, let me go ahead and get started. I've been a noodle lover for about as long as I can remember. And today we're going to be talking about noodles of all sorts. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am with my noodle quest. And we're going to focus on three different types of noodles today. So we're going to take Italy, and we're going to do both the fresh pasta and the durum semolina dry pasta. Then we're going to switch gears and do fresh ramen noodles. We're going to do two different types. One, a very low hydration, pure wheat flour. And then the other, we're going to cut it with a little rye flour, and you can use any flour you want. And then finally, we're going to shift gears and do a couple of gluten-free noodles, or talk about them anyway, a rice noodle, and then a buckwheat noodle or a soba noodle. So with that, let me just say that I never imagined myself as a noodler as a child, but that is where my life has taken me. I started out as a journalist, trained as a Sovietologist. So I ended up in Moscow in the late 80s, as history would dictate. I witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the demise of the Soviet Union, and I was also in Tiananmen Square when that happened. So a very interesting, crazy early career, and decided I would do something a little more peaceful. And I turned to cooking and noodles. When I think back about, some of my early noodle experiences, one thing that came to mind this week, and wow, I hadn't thought about it forever, but I do remember when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I took some dry spaghetti and I went upstairs into the bathroom and turned on the really hot water and plugged the sink, and I just let it run. And maybe a couple of minutes, I don't know how long. In retrospect, pretty nasty, but maybe I was hungry, maybe I was curious, maybe a little bit of both. But I ate the noodles out of the sink. They were a little crunchy. Probably even an Italian would say, nah, that's too much al dente. But that's where my noodle voyage began. And I spent my later part of high school and college years in Europe. Mostly in Scandinavia. So there weren't a lot of noodles at that point. But when I moved further east to Russia, I started to encounter noodles quite often. And as I moved even further east into Central Asia, specifically Uzbekistan, noodles were a primary dish. So they have in Uzbekistan and all of Central Asia and many countries along the Silk Road have both a rice culture and a noodle culture, and you usually end up in one camp or another. I'm a big rice lover as well, but in Central Asia, I really began to explore noodles, and we made everything from noodles with just flour and water. I know with many people at home, a lot of folks have turned to baking, which is amazing because it's several steps beyond noodles. Noodles is the most basic food you can think of. It's a ground flour and water. If you want to get a little more fancy, you can add salt. You can add some sort of fat, be it oil or eggs, and then go on from there. But again, when I was in Central Asia, really started making noodles and dumplings, what they call manti. And it was right after the fall of the Soviet Union. This was in 1994. So Uzbekistan was a newly independent country. And I thought, oh, hey, that would be an interesting place to go. It was right in the center of the Silk Road. So you have China to the far east is the terminus of the Silk Road, and then Venice in Italy, which is where the Silk Road ended. And you have noodles all along that route. Don't believe the myths that Marco Polo brought noodles from China. I think humans are much more inventive and capable to be able to mix a grain and mill it and make a flour and water and come up with a paste, and then eventually come up with noodles that it didn't have to originate in one spot and then travel all around the world. So that myth aside, certainly the Silk Road was a great metaphor and framework for thinking about noodles. And so, as I mentioned, I just kept moving further east. And the first time I went to China was in 1989. It was, that was the same Tiananmen Square trip. I was there for Gorbachev's meeting, and it turned into something much, much more interesting. So I left Beijing as quickly as I could, and instead of flying directly back to the United States, I decided to head west and exit China overland into Pakistan, just for chuckles and grins. And it was a very, very long trip. It was 3 days on a train from Xi'an, which is the ancient capital of China and the terminus of the Silk Road. And it was 3 days by train up to Urumqi in the northwest part of China. It's called the Xinjiang province. And that's where they make noodles like nobody's business. And you've probably seen in restaurants or certainly on YouTube now where they do the hand-pulled noodles. I first saw that back in 1989, and I was so smitten with that whole process. It was just amazing to watch them mix the flour and then pull the noodles and throw it in the pot, and you were eating literally within 5 minutes. And it was performance art. It was amazingly delicious. And 3 days on a train, and then another 3 days on a bus to get to the furthest major city in northwestern China, which is Kashgar. And every stop along the way on the bus, we would stop at a tiny little dusty cafe, and they would make this beautiful hand-pulled noodles. It's called lagman in Uyghur, and not coincidentally, in Chinese, it's called la mian, and in Japanese, it's called ramen, and it's all the same thing. It's not the same process and it's not the same ingredients, but it's the same word. It means noodle. So that's kind of how I got into the noodle world. I was really taken, as I mentioned, with the whole notion of the Silk Road. And I said, all right, look, I've spent some time in China, in Central Asia. I need to go spend some time in Italy now and really make some handmade noodles and pasta. So I went to the north in Bologna because I wanted to make that fresh pasta dough. And I was working with some grandmas who were doing tortellini for commercial production. So they were cranking out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tortellini, both for grocery stores and restaurants, and learned that process and worked with them for about 4 months. It was a scholarship through the International Association of Culinary Professionals. And I was just amazed that you could actually go to Italy and learn how to make handmade pasta on a scholarship. So that was a phenomenal experience. And it really kind of brought everything full circle. So we had the Italian noodles, the Central Asian noodles, the Chinese noodles. And during the last few years, I've really gotten into making my own ramen noodles. And that's, again, it's the simplest ingredient list, flour and water at its most basic level. But the technique varies. And if there's one piece of advice I can give you, no matter what type of noodle you're making, it really just comes down to touch and feel and experience, because you can know the protein percentage for the flour, and you can mix it as always, and something might be just a little bit off if you're only following a recipe blindly. It really comes down to touch, to feel, intuition. So with that, I'm going to switch over and see the questions we've got, and then jump into some specifics about the Italian fresh noodles, because that's where a lot of Americans start anyway in making their noodles. I see a lot of questions about gluten-free, and I'm definitely going to get to that. We're going to talk about making some buckwheat soba noodles and some rice noodles. So let me just start with the Italian pasta. So I made a couple of doughs for you today. One is what you'd find often in a restaurant setting. This is egg. It's half bread flour and half semolina flour, and no salt, no water, no oil. So generally, a rule of thumb is you're going to use 1 egg for every 100 grams of flour. So if you're using cups, maybe 2 or 3 eggs per cup of flour. And again, try a recipe, get comfortable with it, make your adjustments to it, and then you're going to see it begin to come together. The other one I made, and this is a little bit more, I guess, not difficult, it's just different. This is a pure semolina and water. This is what, if it was put through an extruder and dried, this is what you would get in a box of pasta. But I wanted to show you these two, and I've got 2 main technique points for you. One is about kneading it, and then the other is once you start to roll it through a pasta roller. You don't have to have a pasta roller. You roll it out with a rolling pin and roll it as thin or as thick as you want, and then use a knife. But let me show you real briefly, and I hope this works. I just want to show you very quickly about the technique. Got the there should be a method to the madness. Now, when I'm watching students with their ball of dough, once it's rested, they're either afraid to touch it, so they're like, this is nasty, I don't want to get my hands dirty, or they're just like beating it up and they're just smashing it, and there's no method at all. So you can see there's a seam on the bottom, and no matter whether you're making bread or any type of dough, you're going to have the seam on the bottom, and that's what you want to work with. Is keep the seam in the back, and you can see I'm just pushing down and turning and pushing, and it doesn't really look like there is a method, but there surely is, and it does 2 things. One is it begins to stretch the outside of the dough and make it very smooth, and the other, it keeps the seam in the back. And once you let it rest a little bit longer, that seam is gonna disappear, and you can cut those those noodles seamlessly. Let me come back into view. And then the other point, you probably, if you've used the dough cutter before, or the pasta roller, again, I've seen every possible variation in a classroom with the students. I was doing a demo once in St. Petersburg, Russia, and we mixed the dough, and then all of a sudden the students started to go off on their own, and they started to jam the udon dough through these metal rollers. And the first one pops, and then the second one pops, and the third one pops. And like, no, do not put that dough through the roller. And the reason why is because a lot of times they'll just take a big chunk of dough and just try to smash it down. What I'd recommend is just go ahead and cut the dough into a manageable shape. Now, I know it's a lot of fun, particularly for kids, when you get a piece of dough and you keep running it through the rollers and it gets longer and longer and longer, and you got to have people help you. But, just take a small piece, because once you run a piece like this through, it's going to end up about that long, and that's probably good. You're not making longevity noodles here. This piece of ramen dough. But what my point is, when you're putting it through the roller, you've got a piece of dough, and you can see this is, once you're used to handling dough, you can see it's pretty sturdy. You don't want to hold it with your fingers and poke it, but you use the back of your hand or your full palm or things like that. It's a very sturdy dough, and that's the beauty of gluten. But once you run it through a few times, and particularly this is ramen dough, so the running it through the rollers with ramen dough is actually the kneading process. If you're doing it at home, you can either work it really hard with a rolling pin and work up a lot of sweat, or just use the pasta roller and put it through several times. But again, there's really one thing I want you to take away when you're running any sort of pasta through the roller. You'll put it through, and like the first time you push it through the roller, you're going to come up with something like this. And you can see the edges are all jagged. And if you're a perfectionist, this kind of stuff drives you crazy. So the point is, you run it through a few times and go increasingly smaller. 1 is the largest setting on most of the pasta. You come through, and then many of the recipes or instructions say either do a double fold or a trifold. I heartily recommend a trifold. So you're taking the sheet of dough and you fold it like a book, and you fold it like a book. What that does is, and then you're turning it 90 degrees to run it back through the rollers. So you enlarge it again. So you might run it through the largest setting, and then the next smallest, and then do a trifold. Do the trifold, and then you turn it 90 degrees to put it in. And what happens is you create nice and beautiful seams on the side. And once you start rolling it through and you get no breakage on the seams, your dough is ready then to cut. That's the clue. Again, just like when you're kneading the dough, you're going to want to keep the seams always on the back side. So you might be able to see there's a little seam right here. So you're folding, doing the trifold, you put it back through. Now there's going to be a seam right here where the dough meets. As the dough softens and you're working it through, you're going to get the beautiful edge. This is beginning to have a nice edge here, but it could be a little smoother. It's going to taste the same, but then you're ready to cut. So that's my tip for rolling any sort of fresh pasta. We discussed in general about the ratio of eggs to flour. You're going to see also a lot of recipes that say use the 00 Italian flour, and it's a beautiful flour. It's great for pizzas. It's great for baked goods, and it's amazing for the fresh pasta. Can you make really great Italian fresh egg pasta with all-purpose flour? Absolutely. And that's what I want you to do. Use what flour you have on hand, provided it's a flour that has gluten. And the flours, obviously, that we're going to be using for this are the wheat flours. And the more of the endosperm that is ground or milled, the higher the protein content. And you can quickly go down a rabbit hole on the types of flours and the protein content. And unless you're producing pasta commercially, or you just got a lot of time on your hands, it's probably not worth it to get into that level of detail. Work with a recipe or a formula that works for you. You perfect it, and then you can start trying some other things. So those are the two main pasta formulas that I wanted to bring up as far as Italian goes. I believe on the live event site you can see there's a PDF of the links of some suggested formulas or recipes. So you might look there. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about ramen. I've eaten ramen all my life, and like most of us, my first introduction to ramen was the dried stuff, and I ate it all through college and was known for the amazing ramen that I made because I added other stuff to it. It wasn't anything that I did, but it was being in Japan and Singapore about 5 years ago. I remember going from Japan to Singapore, and this restaurant was so proud that they had a ramen machine. And basically, they dumped in some flour, and they put in water, and they turned on the machine, and out popped ramen. I'm like, okay, well, it's pretty basic, but I'd like to make it myself. So I already had the noodle making basics. A few years earlier, I had spent a couple of weeks in China studying with a noodle master to do the hand-pulled noodles. So I said, all right, ramen is getting to be bigger and bigger here. I had a friend who had a restaurant, and he wanted to make fresh ramen. I said, all right, let's play around with this, come up with a couple of formulas that work for you. So the two that I want you to work with, let me just check to see which one. Yeah, the one I recommend is just a basic ramen before you get into these low hydration doughs. And all that means is that you divide the amount of water by the amount of flour. And anything under 40 is going to be really hard to work with, and it's going to start crumbling. And anything as you start getting over 50 into 60, it's going to be sticky and gummy. And that's where your issues come up when you start trying to roll it out or cut it. It's either it's not the right consistency, it hasn't rested long enough, and those are the two main issues. So the two types of ramen that I made are a basic ramen dough, as I mentioned, and the other one is the formula here is for a whole wheat. And instead of whole wheat, I took rye flour and I toasted it, and then mixed it in with the bread flour, and it's very fragrant in a raw state, and I was afraid it was going to be overpowering. But last night we cooked it, and it was absolutely divine. So those are the two ramen that I want to suggest you try. Try a basic one with a higher hydration, and I believe this one it's about 38-40% that I'm suggesting you use, and you can get the feel for it. The key to making good ramen at home is that it's a 3-day process. Don't worry, you're not cooking for 3 straight days. And I actually like it that way because on day 1, you just mix the dough. And you can do it by hand, of course. If you have a mixer with the blades, I would suggest you do that. Why? Because instead of developing the gluten like you would using a paddle in your KitchenAid mixer, and I do not recommend that, do not throw ramen dough into a KitchenAid mixer. You're probably going to break it or burn out the motor. But if you use a mixer with the blade, what it does is it fully incorporates all the ingredients, and it's slicing through the dough, and so it's also essentially inhibiting the gluten development. And when you're done with that, it's kind of like sand, wet sand, and so it'll clump together and it'll stay together. But here's the key: you mix it on night 1, and you roll it out into a flat sheet, something like this. Cut it into sheets, and then put it in the refrigerator. That whole thing takes about a half an hour. It's great. You're done. The next day, you're going to start rolling it out, as I suggested before. You can start out with something about that thick, and use a rolling pin and roll it down to about that thickness. And again, you can keep rolling it with the rolling pin and then hand cut. That's fantastic. Or you can use the pasta roller and keep going down. I use a Marcato brand, and I go down to about setting 5, and then I cut it with essentially the angel hair cutter, and it makes beautifully square but looks round ramen noodles. So that's day 2. You roll it out, and then you actually cut the noodles. You put them in the bag, and if you want, you can freeze it and use it later, because again, it's just the bread flour. There is some vital gluten added to it as well, and water. So you're not going to get discoloration. You're not going to get any sort of frozen crystals in the freezer. It's going to be great. And if you keep it in your refrigerator, you can keep it for up to 2 or 3 days. The dough is wonderfully dry. You can clump it together. I'll actually grab some noodles I've already cut and show you. You can push it together, and it's not going to stick together. Again, it's because it's such a low hydration dough. Also dusted with potato flour. But you squish it together, and that's going to give it those little crinkly loops and curls like you find in the dried pasta or the extruded ramen noodles. So also, because you're dusting it with potato flour or some sort of starch, you can use cornstarch, whatever you want. When you're cooking the noodles, that's why you're going to want to rinse them when they're done, to make sure you get all that extra starch off of them. So finally, that's ramen. We're going to shift gears and talk about the no gluten doughs and noodles. So that's an entirely expansive world. The thing you have to always keep in mind is Many of all the gluten-free are not made with wheat flour, so you don't have that gluten development to give the pasta its structure. So you either have to let the ground seeds, like in the case of buckwheat, you have to let it sit in water for a long time, or you can mix it with a number of things like a tapioca starch, arrowroot. One formula I found uses psyllium powder, which is a beautiful fiber, and when you put it in water, it gets really thick and viscous, almost like an egg yolk. And this is buckwheat with psyllium powder. Yeah, okay. Is it traditional Japanese buckwheat soba? No, it's not. But if you are gluten intolerant and you can't add a little bit of flour, which is the other thing I recommend, if you can eat wheat flours, just add it to the buckwheat and practice that first until you get the technique down. But if not, the psyllium powder really makes a nice dough. And again, I made this last night. I made the noodles. They were divine, and it was a great way. I also included a buckwheat recipe with just buckwheat and water and a little bit of lemon juice or some sort of acid, and it is a crumbly cake and really is almost impossible to put through a roller. So you have to work it by hand on the counter with a rolling pin. So you don't get frustrated. I would definitely start with a very basic pasta dough recipe. Get used to the texture and the quality. Again, it should be very smooth and not tacky or sticky to the touch. You also want to keep it covered so it doesn't dry out like this. But once you get comfortable with that, then just start expanding out and experiment. It's a great thing to do with your kids as you watch these noodles appear from the pasta cutter, or you cut them with a knife, and there is truly a difference in taste. So I'm going to stop right there. That's a lot of information for you right now. And let me just go to a few questions and see what we can get through. I've got Marina asking the best options for vegan gluten-free noodles, both store-bought and homemade. Well, thank you, Marina, for that question. One thing that I'm sure you've all seen is the proliferation of gluten-free items in the stores. The number of gluten-free options, flours, and the amount of flours that are available, it's just phenomenal. So, you know, I think the easiest gluten-free noodle to start with, Marina, and it's a lot of fun and incredibly delicious, is a rice noodle. And again, all you do is you take rice flour, add a little bit of water, maybe some tapioca flour to give it a little bit more elasticity and connectivity. Actually, I'm gonna see if I can drop in. No, I'm not going to do that. I was gonna pass along a recipe, but I'll do that later. And it's a very liquid mixture, so it's not going to be a dough like this because it's not intended to be cut or extruded. So a lot of rice flours, or whether you're making it with potato starch, sweet potatoes, mung bean starch, all of these things, they're usually a little more a liquid dough, and they're pressed through like a potato ricer into boiling water, and then that's how the noodles are formed. But with the rice noodle that I'm recommending today, is you make a liquid batter, and it's very thin. It's thinner than pancake batter. You put it on an oiled dish, like a Pyrex glass dish, or you can use even metal. Just brush it with oil and put it in a steamer for about 5 minutes. You pull it out with a plastic spatula, lay it down on your cutting board, you cut the noodles, and you're ready for an amazing pad thai dish. And it's so fun to make, and you'll be amazed that you weren't making these many, many years earlier. Lynn's also asking about gluten-free noodles. I really don't know brands because I'm not buying the brands of gluten-free, but let me get back to you because I see a lot of questions along those lines of specific brands. Terry B is asking about flour options, and again, that's a rabbit hole. It's a fun one. I did include a PDF that describes some of the basic flours that you're going to find, and then some more unusual flours. And again, in English, we call anything that's ground a flour, but really, when we're talking about flour, it's wheat. So the other ones technically are a meal or a grind, but you can find on that PDF all the different types of flours, and then some of their protein content, because that's really the key when you're making the noodles is how hard the dough is to work with is probably using a higher protein flour. So Mary D is asking for a noodle with chew to use in soup that doesn't lose its body once it's been in good broth. Well, that is the holy grail for everybody, whether it's ramen or a fresh pasta in Italy, or even using a dried pasta. So, yeah, as you mentioned, what could you do? Maybe you cook it very al dente before it goes into the broth. With ramen, you're adding a little bit of vital wheat gluten. That's available at many supermarkets now. You can certainly buy it online. So just to give you a sense, flours, the wheat flours range at the low end with cake and pastry, the 6 to 8% protein, up to when you start to getting to the bread flours, the semolina, in the 15-16% protein. Wheat gluten has 75% protein. So you might add just a touch of wheat gluten to give it that chewiness. That's exactly what you're doing with ramen. You might try it with your Italian pasta, but again, be careful, because if you use too much of it and you're dropping it in your KitchenAid mixer, I don't want to be the one responsible for burning out that motor. But it will certainly give that chew that you're looking for. All right. Scott is asking about udon, making udon for the first time. Yeah, thank you, Scott. What flour do I recommend? Well, as many of you on this call, if you've made the udon recipe from Ruby, they call for bread flour. It's a bread flour, water. I think there's salt in that recipe. And you roll it out by hand. What I've seen where people are having trouble is they don't let it rest long enough. So they mix it together, and it's just holding tight because the gluten is all developed. And then you want to start rolling it out, and it's so hard to cut. And the students are like, it doesn't seem right. And then I cook it, and it gets bigger and things like that. Well, yes, the noodles are going to swell, whether it's Italian pasta or ramen or udon. The noodles are going to swell a little bit, so keep that in mind. when you're mixing it, let it rest. So yeah, Scott, that's I'd definitely I'd use a bread flour. You can use AP. It's going to make a fine udon, but use a bread flour or the 00 Italian, and you're gonna be pleased with the results there. It is hard to work with. It is hard to roll out. It is hard to cut, and that's why we're all not making udon at home every day. But for those of you who are on this call today, you like exploration, you love noodles, you're going to make that extra effort, and it'll certainly be worthwhile. Kate P, I'm trying to learn how to mill my own flours. Oh, God bless you. And blends with my Como mill. Wow, how fun. Do I have any resources that I can refer to you? I will send you some, but you probably know this if you have your own mill. They're going to those flours are going to react differently than the commercially available flours, and that's the beauty of it. I mean, that's the beauty of cooking is you're taking an organic ingredient, and you can have a recipe and you can follow a formula, and you're like, I don't get it. Why doesn't it work? Because it's organic material, and everything is a little bit different. We're all unique. So yeah, I wish you great success with your milling. I think you're definitely gonna taste the difference. You're gonna taste the nuttiness of the kernel. But let me send you some resources offline. That'd be great. Keep on milling. That is great stuff. Judith B says, whoa, so what kind of mixer do you use to mix your ramen noodles? It's just I don't even know the brand name. I think it's DeLonghi. It's just a typical mixer that you'd use to chop up a salsa or puree some vegetables. So again, you pour in the flours if you're using different types of flours and salt, and you mix it up first. So you get all of the dry ingredients fully mixed. And slowly add in your liquid into the top. And again, you might be adding eggs, you might be adding a little bit of oil. The blades are going to incorporate everything, but without developing the gluten. And please listen very carefully. If you feel and sense that your motor is having a trouble, just stop and use your muscles. But it's a great way to mix them right away. You can continue to knead by hand, which you're going to need to do. Or with the ramen, I don't knead it. I roll it out essentially into bricks and let it rest for another day or two, and then I'll cut it. Have you heard? This Catherine Z is asking, have I heard of boiling noodles in baking soda or alkaline solution to yield a chewy texture? I know this is a technique used in Chinese cooking, but I have not tried it. Can you elaborate on this? Well, yes, I can. I was first introduced to the concept of adding alkaline to a dough when I was studying with my noodle master in China. So if you've seen the hand-pulled noodles, you know that you're going to work that dough like no other dough you've ever done, whether it's for bread or ramen or Italian pasta. You are really going to work it to death, and you're going to push a lot of water into it and a lot of salt. But the alkaline, what they found was it gave that gluten more elasticity. And one of the original places that they pulled or they discovered that adding an alkaline solution to a noodle dough would help in its properties was in Inner Mongolia. So it's the northern part of China. There's a Lake Khan, and the water is alkaline, and so in Japanese, the name for the ash is called kansui. In Chinese, it's called penghui. And essentially, what you buy commercially is it's mugwort root that has been powdered. And again, if you're going down the rabbit hole of flowers and its acidity or alkalinity, you can see that there are times where you want to add an alkaline solution to the dough. On the ramen noodle recipes that I've shared with you, they add both sodium bicarbonate, which is an alkaline salt, which is basic baking soda that's been baked. So baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. You bake it, it becomes sodium carbonate, and essentially an alkaline salt. You do see recipes online where they just say add baking soda and it'll work. It's a little different flavor. But they also add and suggest that you add potassium bicarbonate. And potassium bicarbonate is what you find in commercial uses as a dough softener. But again, when you're using vital wheat gluten that's 75% protein, you have to have a way to relax that dough so you can actually work with it before you start rolling it out or cutting it. So I haven't seen adding alkaline to the water that the noodles are boiled in. I have seen it added to the water in making the dough. And also in China, when they're doing the hand-pulled noodles, you often see they have the noodles already set aside. They're usually oiled so they don't dry out. And what they'll do is they'll squirt it with a little alkaline solution. So almost immediately it becomes more pliable. Oftentimes it's a bluish color. It smells like sulfur. But that smell disappears once you cook it. So I hope that answered your question with alkaline solution. If you're making ramen, you're going to want to use an alkaline solution, and don't be afraid of that. It's the traditional way to do it. Linda H says, quick question for this new cook. Should I rinse spaghetti under cold running water to remove the starch? I don't. So, I drain the pasta directly into the sink, and then generally I will take the spaghetti and mix it in with my sauce and then serve it. If you're going to hold it for longer or not going to mix the sauce, add a tiny bit of oil, very tiny bit of oil, so it doesn't turn into a clump. The amazing thing about the internet is you can find out anything. And the amazing thing about the internet is you can find out so many wrong ways to do everything. You're going to see everything, and as I'm sure you've seen. So I don't rinse my dried Italian pasta. So this might seem like a silly or obvious question. Those are my favorite. What is the difference between egg noodles and regular pasta noodles if they also contain eggs? Well, there's nothing. So generally the distinction in Italy is you make what's called a fresh egg pasta. And that's what this is. And you roll it out and you use it right away. Some places will dry it out a little bit and for an hour or so and then cook it, but you don't want to store it for hours because it will begin to turn brown. It's still fine. You can just reknead it, but the oxidation process will change the color a little bit and turns gray. And so if they both contain eggs, it's an egg noodle. Now in the East, they have like a chow mein, which is an egg noodle. It's essentially the same formula as an Italian pasta, probably a little less egg than in the fresh. But with Italian fresh pasta, the reason there's so much egg is you want that silkiness, you want that fat, You want that pliability, and particularly if you're making dumplings and tortellini, because it sticks and it adheres better. It's a beautiful texture. So not a silly question at all. An egg noodle is an egg noodle, and a gluten-free noodle has no wheat. Dumpling dough. Dumpling dough is the same as a noodle dough. And again, it's the entire spectrum. So it could just have flour and water, particularly if it's like a large dumpling and you really want to feature what's inside. One of my favorite is a pumpkin. It's really a squash, pumpkin and onion with some ground coriander and cumin. It's just phenomenal. And you really want to feature the flavor of the filling. So you just use a flour and water. And many of the Chinese dumplings, purely flour and water wrappers. But some people prefer the egg because, again, it's richer. It adheres better when you're pinching the seals. And you can go from there. Beginner here, what does blade look like for mixer rather than a paddle? Okay, so on a KitchenAid, you usually have like a whisk, you have the dough hook, and then you have a paddle. You're not going to find the blades in that type of the KitchenAid stand mixer that I'm talking about. It literally is usually it's 2, sometimes 3 blades. You can, it just spins, it just chops. So that's what you're gonna look for. All right. What would you say is the best egg alternative for the same properties? Patrick's asking about that. Tofu, you can certainly use a silken tofu. That's beautiful. Ruby has some recipes that incorporate that. I like psyllium. You could even use the chia seed to get that texture. Also, the garbanzo liquid. So those are some alternatives if you're not going to use egg. Is it okay to use a Vitamix in lieu of a mill to grind flours? Oh boy, Marina, good question. I don't grind my own flours, and I'd be hesitant to answer that question. So let me do some research for you. I mean, a Vitamix is an amazing tool, and it'll certainly grind some. But I can't. It probably doesn't grind it as uniformly, and that's what milling is all about. It's the size of the grain. So that looks like it's going to do it for today. I really appreciate everybody who joined. I will be getting back to you to answer your specific questions if I wasn't able to today. I wish you happy noodling. And have a joyous Thanksgiving if you're in the United States and you celebrate such things. This is noodle season. It is cold outside, and it's a great activity for families to do. Hold a dumpling making party, and everybody's there, and mixing the fillings and making dumplings together. So I hope you have a lovely week, and look forward to speaking to you again. Goodbye.